Well, we're going to launch into the next section on the book of Ruth. We're going to be looking at chapter 1, verses 6 through 14. But I really want to do a quick review because I will tell you, chapter 1, when you're reading a narrative story from a Jewish writer, the first section of the story really sets up all of the tension that will ultimately be resolved in chapter 4. So if you're thinking to yourself things like, wow, this is really tough, this is really hard to hear, welcome to the Jewish audience. As the storyteller is unfolding this story, we know that Naomi is our hero, but Naomi's a very flawed hero, much like all of our heroes are. And because she's a flawed hero, she has to walk through the portions of her flawedness. Is that a word? Flawedness?
Yeah.
We're going to say that's a word. It's a Jewish word.
Say it with authority.
Okay. Her flawedness. In order to be able to really see her shift and move and change. Now remember, there is a tremendous amount that the author is writing here to show the nation of Israel what they were doing. And remember, we have to go back culturally to where we were, and that was the time period in which everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This is a time period in which there was a huge battle between human wisdom and godly wisdom. And what we see over and over again, especially in this first chapter, is that Naomi lands on the human wisdom side. She trusts the human wisdom side rather than the godly wisdom, because at first blush, godly wisdom doesn't look like real wisdom. For instance, there's a famine in the land. Human wisdom says, go where there's food. Godly wisdom says, the blessing is in the land, stay in the land so that I can bless you, because what I'm trying to do out of this, draw the nation back to myself so that I can bless you even more fully. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what godly wisdom does. Human wisdom says, I look at my situation and I immediately go to what the world tells me I should do. I don't have food, I'm going to go find food. So Naomi and Elimelech in the first 5 verses make a number of non-covenantal mistakes. They make a lot of decisions that are not under the covenant decisions that God has placed, the covenant promises that God has made. So they actually walk out from under the covenant promises of God. They leave the land. They go from the house of bread and the place of praise to the washpot in Moab. Elimelech dies, so we know Naomi now has lost, with the exception of her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, she's lost the opportunity for food and children, which is survival of the family, which meant everything. She allows her 2 sons to marry Moabite women, which was against what God had ordained. Her 2 sons die, so now she's really in bad shape. So through a series of her decisions to walk outside of the covenant, we find her in a really tough place right now. And at the end of chapter 1, verse 5, she has no husband, no sons, no hope for food, no hope for children. She's in a strange land that worships a god of fertility that tells you to sacrifice your firstborn. And she's left with 2 outcast daughters from a tribe that God says have no association with. Can it get a whole lot worse for her? Not hardly. Now, there were some covenantal things the nation of Israel was supposed to do. They were supposed to be God's people, to turn people back to Yahweh, to turn people to the covenant God of Israel. They were to show people the covenant God of Israel. And if you'll go back to remember our Life of Glory study, that what we are called to do is to glorify God, to show off his character, to manifest him to his creation. That started with the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel was to manifest God, Yahweh, the covenant-keeping, promise-keeping God of Israel, to the world. That's what they were called to do. Now, let me ask you, is Naomi a child of God?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so what was her call?
Manifest the
To
glory of God.
manifest God, to point people to God. That was her call. Even in Moab, that was her call. So we've got her leaving the land. We've got her in a bad situation. She is sitting with two outcast women, Orpah and Ruth, and she's in a bad shape when we begin chapter 1, verse 6. Now, the way I want to do this today, I want to take a little bit of a detour with us. We're going to learn 4 Hebrew words today. Are you feeling Jewish?
Sure.
Okay. Put your prayer shawls on, get ready. We're going to learn 4 Jewish words today because these Jewish words have a very distinct, they have a foundational play in this entire book. And in these little verses, verses 6 through 14, we're going to uncover these 4 words and what they mean and their relevance not only to Ruth and Orpah, but to us. So we're going to take these 2 verses at a time, starting with verses 6 and 7. Would somebody read verses 6 and 7 out of chapter 1?
Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah.
Okay, stop right there. Now, let me walk you through. We're going to do some deep diving here today. Let me walk you almost word by word through this. Then, so after we get this entire, here's the history of what's happened in the last 10 years to Naomi, our main character. Then Naomi, she arose with her daughters-in-law. Now, the author is giving us a very clear indication. This is Naomi, the child of God, with her 2 daughters-in-law who were outcasts. Now, go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, we get the marriage vow that a man is to leave his mother and father and cleave, become joined as one to his wife. The marriage vow was even closer than was a brother and sister, than was siblings. The marriage vow was meant to keep the family together. And a marriage vow, a marriage itself, a covenantal marriage under God, was meant to be the single strongest bond between 2 people on the face of the earth. So we get this child of God in Naomi and 2 outcast daughters-in-law. Keep in mind that the author's telling us something very distinct. These are daughters-in-law. They were bound to Naomi by marriage, the strongest bond you could have. Have we got the clear picture? Okay. That she, Naomi, might return. Now, here's your first word. The little word return is a Jewish word pronounced this way, shuv, S-H-U-V, shuv. Say that with me, shuv.
Shuv.
Okay, it means to return. It can also, in fact, if you look in the New Testament, we get the Greek word metanoia is the Greek word repent. It's the same word, return, repent, turn away, turn around, come back. That's the word we're talking about here. And in the Jewish language, we don't have a whole lot of superlatives. So if the Jewish author is trying to make a point, he will use repetition. And what you're going to find is in these verses, 6 through 14, the word shuv is going to be used 10 times. And in the entire book of Ruth, shuv is used 15 times. This is a very, very, very important word. And what we're hearing is that Naomi has walked away from the covenant relationship with God found in the land, and what God is doing is calling her to what?
Covenant relationship. Oh,
To return to the covenant relationship.
Okay.
Right. To shuv. Shuv. Let's use that Jewish word. She's supposed to shuv. Okay. So she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might shuv from the country of Moab. So she's now going to return from the wash pot back to her hometown, back to the land of blessing, from the country of Moab. Why? Why is she going to shuv? Why is she going to return? What does the text say she's going to return?
There's bread there.
Food. For food.
Okay, now let me make sure we hear this really clearly. Here's why she's going to return. She had gotten an email or a text.
Yeah.
She had heard through the grapevine while she's in the country of Moab. And again, the author is giving us a really clear indication. While she's in the wash pot, while she's in the garbage dump, she has heard that, and I want you to hear it. She didn't just hear there was food. She heard the Lord had visited. The Lord had visited his people. Now, is she still one of his people? She's still one of his people, even though she's walked outside the covenant blessing. But the Lord has now visited, meaning the famine is over. God has done what he has intended to do. He's either brought about his will, returned the nation to obedience, brought them back to dependence. Something has happened that God has now visited. His presence has been made known back in the land of blessing, and he's brought them bread. Now remember, what does Bethlehem mean? The house of bread. So what God has done is God has now visited the land of bread and brought bread back to the house of bread. So what's happened is, who's been the one that has initiated this? Who's doing all the work here?
God.
God's doing all the work here. So the blessing is still in the land is still where she needs to be, and the first decision that she makes, that we're going to find for all the wrong reasons, she makes the decision to shuv. She turns. Now, if you're a Jewish audience, the first thing you're saying is, oh, good, she's going back to the land. Oh, good, she's coming back to blessing. Oh, good, she's returning to Yahweh, the covenant promise keeper of Israel. But she's returning only for the bread. We're going to find this out in these next verses. She's returning only because there's bread. She's returning because there's food. Now, here's what I can tell you. Somebody made the statement last week about the prodigal son. Why did the prodigal son return?
Food.
He was
hungry.
Yeah.
He was starving.
He had nothing.
He had nothing. And he was returning, and actually he was returning to say, I'd be better off if I was a servant in my father's house than if I'm still sitting here eating pig slop. I'd rather be back there as a servant. He was starving. What do you think Naomi is doing right now? She is starving and ready to go back because she's lost her husband, she's lost her son, she has no food, she has no provider, and she has no lineage to survive her family. Therefore, we always say in Bible study, what's the therefore? So, therefore, since she has heard that the Lord has visited this land and has brought bread, therefore, she went out from the place where she was. Again, who goes with her?
Her daughter-in-law, daughters-in-law.
So these are the two outcast women who are now bonded to her closer than family. These two daughters-in-law are going to go with her, and they went on the way to, here's the word again, to shuv, to return to the land of Judah. Do you know what the word Judah means? Praise. So where are they returning to?
The land of praise.
They're returning to the land of praise. Why is it the land of praise? What's God just done?
He's provided food. He visited.
Provided food. He's just ended the famine. This is wonderful news. She's returning from the garbage dump to the house of bread and to praise. This is fantastic news. So what we get in this first statement is the hint that she's going to return to the covenant promise of God, where there is blessing, where there is land, where there is family, where there is food, where all of that exists. She's going to return to the covenant promise. That's what we think is getting ready to happen. So if we would love to believe, if we put a period here at the end of this, what we'd love to believe is that she's returning for all the right reasons. But what we're going to find here is Naomi is going to really struggle with all of this. And we're going to struggle right along with her. So let's look at it. she's now going to return because the Lord has visited and he has brought bread. And all of this is sitting with an understanding that God, the God of the universe, wants and desires to give us good things. He desires to bless us, which is why he doesn't want us to leave the blessing or leave the land in the first place. So he desires us to return. He is the Father standing on the hill calling us home. He is the Father who wants us to be in the land of blessing. And here's what happens. We start now in verse 8. Somebody read verse 8, just verse 8.
And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, shew each to her own mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me."
Okay, hold it right there. So Naomi, who has made her decision to shew to her land, now looks at her 2 outcast, bonded daughters-in-law and says to them, what you want her to say is, come with me. What she says is, go, return, shew to your mother's house. Go back home. Don't come with me. Go back home. Now, there's several things that are really, really wrong with this statement. The first thing is, what's she asking them to go back to?
Nothing.
The land of idols.
The land of idols, where Chemosh tells them to sacrifice their firstborn children. So she's asking them to return to their mother's house. Now, why is she saying return to their mother's house? What's the reasoning behind this? What's the human reasoning behind this? And she's going to tell us here in a minute, but what do you think is the human reasoning behind this?
Family.
Yeah.
Your
Okay.
family's there.
Return to your family. There's
Right.
another reason she's going to give us, and that is, I can't provide anything for you. I can't provide husbands. I have no more sons. I can't provide food. There's nobody to do it. Go back where you have a future. There is no future with me. Go back to where there's a future. Return to your mother's house. Return to your family. Now remember, under the covenant, which is the closer bond? Orpah and Ruth to Naomi because they're bound to them by marriage, or Orpah and Ruth back to their mother's house? Which is the stronger bond?
Naomi.
Naomi is the stronger bond. So what's Naomi actually asking them to do?
Break the covenant.
Break the
Break
covenant.
the covenant. And not only break the covenant, but return to an idol-filled land where you're going to be sacrificing your children in order to get what looks like to be what human wisdom would say you want: family, children, food. But remember, has God not visited Bethlehem? So is the hope for food there?
Yes.
Yes.
So there is this pull for them to return. And what was Naomi's response as a child of God to be to these 2 outcast women? Who's she supposed to point them toward?
Toward God.
And where's she pointing them?
Idols.
She's pointing them away. Now, I know this sounds harsh on Naomi, but what I'm trying to set up here is this is really difficult because we know Naomi's in a tough place. But understand what she's doing. This is that huge interplay between human wisdom and godly wisdom. Godly wisdom says, get back to the land, come back into relationship with me, come back where the blessing is. The covenant relationship is stronger, even stronger, even when you have married outside the covenant. That bond is still something that God's going to honor. Now, let me ask you this question. She's now made the decision to return, and what has God begun to bless her with? The promise of
Food.
Grandchildren.
Food.
Food.
The promise of food is there. He's already begun to bring that promise back to bear, and yet she wants to turn her daughters-in-law away from this. So that's first. Let's look at verse 9. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. And actually, that should be translated, each in the house of her new husband. In other words, go back to your mother's house, find husbands there, And the Lord grants you rest with your husbands, your new husbands, in their homes.
Mine says another.
So understand what we've got here. She's telling them, go back, find husbands, and God will grant you that rest, even though you're outside the covenant land, outside the covenant blessing, and I'm sending you back. Here's the interesting phrase. Back up in verse 8, she says, the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. That word kindly there is our second Hebrew word. It is the word chesed, H-E-S-E-D, chesed. Say that one with me, chesed. Okay, get a little phlegm in the back of your throat.
Yeah.
Get that one going. Chesed. Okay, now wipe off the paper in front of you from all the spit that's gone on. Okay. Chesed translates to this. It is loyal love. It is kindness. May the Lord's loyal love be on you. Now let's be honest. Where is the Lord's loyal love going to be most evident? In Moab
In
or
the
Bethlehem?
land. Bethlehem.
In the land. It's where his loyal love, his promise, his abundant blessing promise has been given to be there. So where are they going to recognize, or Orpah and Ruth going to recognize the loyal love of God more? In Moab, back with Chemosh, with husbands who will follow a different God, or with Naomi going to Bethlehem?
Naomi.
That's where the loyal love of God is going to be. So she wants to send them back, and she asks for a blessing, for God to grant them rest, a blessing upon them with their new husbands. She kisses them, they lift up their voices, and they weep. The difficulty in all of this is that at every turn, Naomi is continuing to push people, to push Orpah and Ruth, her two bonded daughters-in-law, away from God rather than to him, even though she is going to return. She still thinks they're going to be better off in Moab with Moabite men so that they can have children and they can have food. If I was to put this really plainly, I would say this. Naomi is saying this to Orpah and Ruth because her God is not big enough to overcome food and children. And yet the most important thing for God is the survival of the family, is the thriving of the family.
You have one there.
And what the nation of Israel was to do was to point people directly to God. So we get Naomi pointing them away from God, and yet the author is telling us she should be pointing them to the return, to come back to God. Now I laid a bunch of questions on you at the end of last week that I hope you've had the chance during the week to just ruminate over those questions, but I want to leave you with one at the end of this section right here. And it's this. And it's an incredibly convicting question. And it's the one that's hit me about 4 times this week. How many times, by my words or my actions, have I turned people away from God rather than drawing them to him? How many times, by my words or my actions, have I actually pushed people away from God rather than drawing them to him? I'm sorry that's a convicting question, and it just had the deafening effect on this crowd. But this is exactly what the author is trying to tell us Naomi has done. Instead of drawing people to Yahweh and his chesed, his loyal love, getting them to return to the covenant relationship, return to the covenant blessing, return to the covenant promises of God, she has said, human wisdom says, there is nothing for you here. My God can't do this. So I'm going to send you back to your gods, your people, your old way of life. And I'll ask it again. How many times, by my words and my actions, do I turn people away from God rather than draw them to Him? That's one to just convictingly think about during the week. So Naomi basically tells Orpah and Ruth, life is not with me, life is back in your old home. And we continue, and verse 10 says, and they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. Surely we will shuv with you to your people. Now, what are we actually saying here? What is the author setting up? What are we seeing here? What's the irony of the situation?
Well, they wanted to go with her. They said they wanted to go.
They were
Okay.
willing.
So who is it that says they want to go with her?
The daughters. And
Both of them.
The daughters-in-law, who are they children of God or are they outcasts?
They're out.
They're outcast.
So who's actually telling Naomi the good thing to do is to return to Yahweh?
The outcasts.
The outcasts. Instead of Naomi saying, return with me, the two outcasts are saying, surely it's better for us to return with you. It's better for us to stay in the covenant bond of marriage. It's better for us to stay with Yahweh. It's better for us to stay and go with you to the land of blessing. It's pretty obvious that they have heard about Yahweh from Naomi, because this question is, surely we should return with you to you and your people. We should shuv with you. We should go with you. That's where there seems to be the best possibility and chance for us, because we're going to where Yahweh is. We're going to where your God is. And it's just an ironic thing that these two Moabite, garbage dump, outcast women are telling the child of God, it's best for us, surely, that we should shuv with you. We should return with you. Boy, the storyteller's given us a huge indicator of this balance between human wisdom and word. Naomi's landing right now on the side of human wisdom. Go home. The two outcasts who should be following human wisdom are actually saying, nope, we should be going with you to Yahweh. They're actually displaying the godly wisdom. You see, the storyteller's done a beautiful job in one sentence of turning this whole story on its ear. So we now get the response that these two Moabite women say, surely we should shuv, we should return to your God, who is the one who is displaying loyal love. He is the chesed God. We want to follow you to go see this God, to go be a part of this God. We do not want to leave you. Verse 11. And we get that contrasting word that starts this sentence. And what's that contrasting word? But. We get that word that says, hold it, wait a minute, but. And by contrast to the two Moabite daughters-in-law, the author says, Naomi says, turn back. Here's that word again, shuv. My daughters, listen to what she calls them. Naomi says to them, shuv, return my daughters. Let's not forget who you are. You are my daughters. That's how close the bond of marriage is. You return my daughters. And here's what she says. Why will you go with me? She's going to give them 4 reasons why they should not return to Bethlehem with her. Bless you. So she says, why in the world, by human wisdom, why in the world would you go with me? Why in the world would you return to my land, return to Yahweh? Here's the first question, or the first reason. Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Now, the idea behind this is what's called a levirate marriage. And a levirate marriage was this. This was God's protection on women. That if a woman married into a family and her husband died, it was the brothers in the family responsibility to marry the woman and keep her in the family, keep children in the family, keep food on her table. It was the family responsibility and primarily the brother's responsibility to perform a levirate marriage, to marry her and to keep her in the family so she was protected. So she was under the wing of Yahweh. She was under the protection of the children of God, that family. What she's saying to them is, I don't have any more sons. She's saying, I cannot provide you a levirate marriage, which, by the way, was a covenant promise to care for the widows and the orphans, a covenant promise by levirate marriage. There are not still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands. So the first thing she says is, I can't give you husbands. I can't give you a levirate marriage. There are no brothers. By the way, this comes from Deuteronomy 25. This was a promise of God in the law that the woman was to be taken care of. She was to be protected. She was to be provided for. So I can't give you husbands according to a levirate marriage. So the first thing she says is, you can't come back. It's not good that you come back with me because there are no more sons. There's no more opportunity for you to marry in this family. I cannot continue that line for you, that legacy for you. That's the first thing she says. Second reason she gives, verse 12, turn back, my daughters, for I am too old to have a husband. Now, she says, shuv again, turn back. She calls them my daughters one more time. Just keep in mind, the storyteller is just giving us this repetition, shuv my daughters, when she should be saying, shuv my daughters with me. She says, shuv my daughters, go back. Here's the second reason, I'm too old to have a husband. Who does this sound like? Who do we know in Israel's past that said, I'm too old?
Sarah.
And yet, was her age something God couldn't overcome?
Never.
Is this a situation in which Naomi is saying, my God is too small? My God can't overcome this. So the second reason she says is, turn back, my daughters, for I'm too old to have a husband. Now, we're going to come up on this third Hebrew word here, but it's also her response. She says, I'm too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, this is the third word. The Hebrew word for hope is tikvah. Tiqvah. Say that one with me. Tikvah. Tikvah. So here's what she's saying. Don't return with me because I'm going back and I have no hope. If you come back with me, there's no hope for you either. There's no hope for children. There's no hope for husbands. There's no hope for family because I don't have a line anymore. There's nothing in my line. There's no children. There's no husband. Nothing can be done. There is no hope. Don't we know God to be the God of hope? And isn't this the same God that parted the Red Sea, that created the earth in 6 days, that did all of the things that he did, that rescued the nation of Israel time and time again, even coming out of the Judges, time and time again, rescued them? This is a God who has done magnificent things. Do we think that providing children for Orpah and Ruth would be something that he couldn't do? So Naomi says, first, I don't have husbands. Second, there's no inheritance line for you. There's no hope for you. There's no breadwinner for you. I can't provide this for you. Isn't it interesting that what she's really saying is, I can't provide this? Well, who's going to be the one that's going to provide it in the first place, her or God?
God.
Okay, we continue because she's going to give us another reason here. And she says this, at the end of verse 12, if I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and he should also bear sons. In other words, if I went back and I got married now, we're still talking about 13, 14, 15 years before there are husbands, sons who would become husbands. And it would be foolish of you to think that you should wait that long. You need to be able to be married now and start having children. That's what needs to happen. Would you wait for them, verse 13, till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? In other words, you shouldn't. You should not have to do this. That's why you need to go back. Don't come with me and wait. Gee, isn't God a God of patience? There's all sorts of reasons behind why this should happen, but remember, go back to the Abrahamic covenant. What did God promise Abraham? Land,
Land,
seed. They're in the covenant promise. Seed is going to happen. The covenant promise of seed is going to be there, and God has remained faithful to that covenant promise. So land, seed, blessing, where does he want to bless them? In the land. God can do this. He is a big enough God to do this. She says in verse 13, would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much. She wants them to be blessed, and that's obvious. But the way she wants them to be blessed is by human standard, not by the way God says, I'm going to bless you. And God says, I'm going to bless you because the covenant marriage is stronger. The blessing is in the land. This is where I'll provide. And I'm a big enough God to do something as simple as bring food and give you children. I'm a big enough God to do that. And he's proven that over the course of time. So again, she's looking at these two Moabite women and she's continuing to push them outside the covenant relationship. She's continuing to push them away from the covenant God of Israel. Finally, and this is the one that really nails home where she is. What she says at the end of this, at the end of verse 13 is, no, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Now let's just recap for just a minute. And this may sound harsh, but I'm going to recap for just a minute. Naomi and Elimelech leave the land. Were they supposed to?
No.
They leave the land during famine. What were they supposed to do during a famine?
Stay in the land.
Stay in
the blessing.
They go to Moab. Were they supposed to go to Moab?
No.
They allow their sons, she allows her sons, because Elimelech's died by now, she allows her sons to marry Moabite women. Was she supposed to do that?
No.
She decides to return because she's heard God has visited the land. Was she supposed to return?
Yes.
Yes. Was she supposed to bring her daughters with her?
Yes.
Yes.
Instead, she tells them, go back to Moab, where there is hope, where there is family, where there is hope for husbands, where there is hope for children. Don't come here. And here's her reasoning, because God has dealt unkindly with me. Now, let me just take you back. Let me walk you all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Remember the garden? Adam and Eve, the fall. Who does Adam blame? Let's talk about it here. They're walking in the garden. They've hidden from God. God says, where are you, Adam? Adam says, I'm hiding because I knew I was naked. Who told you you were naked? Who does Adam blame his sin on?
Eve.
Let's talk about it. The first person Adam blames his sin on is God. Because what he says is, you gave her to me.
You gave me.
Who does Adam blame first? God.
God.
Who does Naomi blame for her situation?
God.
How many times do I, when I find myself in a situation where by my own decisions, I find the consequences are not what I like, and my first response is to blame God, whose desire is for me to be blessed, to be in relationship, to be in the land, to be in Christ, to be blessed abundantly. And by the way, sent his son to the cross so that I could be. You begin to see comparison here? This is why I told you the first week, I so identify with Naomi. This is also why I've said it's not a chick's book. I am Naomi over and over and over and over again. I am Naomi. And here's the amazing thing. If you go back to Genesis, God says to Adam, by the way, here is all the blessing in the world. Just don't do this one thing, right? Everything in the garden is yours to enjoy. Just don't do this one thing. And what's the one thing that he focuses on? What's the one thing that he focuses, the one thing that God says don't do? That's what we say, God, you're an unfair God because I can't do this
Yeah.
one thing. Look at the multitude of blessing that is going to surround Naomi here. Food, land, people, the continuation of her seed line, all the covenant promises that are there. And the one thing she can't have is the one thing that she blames God for. You're the one who gave me the situation I'm in. And there's no conversation here at all about all the different decisions that Naomi has made down through up to this point, including turning her daughters away. And she blames it all on God. It is an unbelievably convicting statement, not only to the nation of Israel, but I'll tell you, it's an unbelievably convicting statement to me, because this is me so much of the time, that I find myself through my own human wisdom, through my own human decisions, in a situation where the consequences are things I don't want, and yet I look at God and say, why did you let this happen? Why did this happen? I have a good friend of mine, lives down in Houston. He's lost his home. He's lost everything because all of the different inheritances that he got, he squandered. And for a long period of time, he looked at this and he said, God, why have you allowed this to happen? Now, the interesting thing about him, and he's a strong believer, one of my best friends, he's finally come back around to, God, I can see where you're allowing this to create something different in me, to change my character. I see what you're doing here. But could you do something in the next month? Could you do something in the next week? Could you make it happen now? I want to give you just a, let me give you this the Greek word patience literally translates remain under. What God does when he desires to build patience in us is he allows us to remain under our circumstance so that the fullness of what he's desiring to do in us can happen. He's allowing Naomi, and we're going to find this as the story unfolds. Naomi's going to learn through patience, through how God works, through the everyday mundane things of life. Naomi's going to learn to return to the covenant God of Israel. She's going to be the hero in the end. Please understand that. But we're going to follow through with her through some very, very painful circumstances to get to this end. And part of that is this last verse. Look at verse 14. Then they, the two daughters-in-law, lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Now, Orpah kissed her and went back. Do we ever hear about Orpah again? We ever hear the name Orpah again in Scripture? No.
No.
Ruth clings to her. Do we ever hear Ruth again?
Yes. Many.
Ruth actually ends up being in the lineage of Christ.
Yes.
Now, this final Hebrew word I'm going to give you is the word dabak. D-A-B-A-Q, dabak. Say that one with me, dabak. And it means to cling, to cleave. And it's this final word here, Ruth dabaked to her mother-in-law. She clung to her. The idea behind this is, well, let me put it this way. When I was in high school, that's when they invented super glue. I'm dating myself horribly, but that's when they invented super glue. And we used to, super glue when it first came out was clear, odorless, no color to it. And we loved in high school super gluing guys' pens and pencils to their desk. We super glued books to desk.
Yes.
Until we recognized something that was you could super glue your fingers together. And when you super glued your fingers together, you couldn't get them apart. And when super glue first came out, there was no antidote.
That's right.
There was nothing that dissolved super glue when it first came out on the market. The word debauch here, if I could put it in our terminology today, Ruth was super glued to Naomi with no antidote. That's what we get here. And as a matter of fact, what Ruth is going to give us, because this goes all the way back to leave your father and mother and cleave to one another. It's the same word, debak. This is actually a covenant vow that Ruth is going to make. We're going to look at it next week, this covenant vow in verses 16 and 17. It's a covenant vow that Ruth makes to Naomi that says, my bond to you is stronger than anything. I am going to cling to you. I am going to cleave to you. I am going to become super glued to you with no antidote.
Mm.
What we get in this is that, and understand this, if I'm Ruth and I'm hearing what Naomi's telling me, I'm just telling you, human wisdom tells me right now, get as far away from her as you possibly can. I don't want to be around this bitter, negative woman who is telling me, go back. In actuality, what's happening here is that Naomi is saying, I've told you all this about God, but don't believe me because he can't do it. What Ruth is saying is, I believe you about your God. And I'm going to come with you. We're going to see this in her covenant vow. I'm going to come with you because of your God, because of what you've told me about your God. That's why I'm going to follow you. That's why I'm going to cling to you. That's why I want to be with you. Who is actually operating in the covenant promise right now, the covenant relationship, Ruth or Naomi?
Ruth.
How ironic is that? The outcast is the one who's actually walking in the covenant relationship. Wow. What an unbelievable statement. Let me leave you with a quick story, and then I'm going to tie these 4 Hebrew words together. Story goes like this. There was a young woman. She was a widow. She was living with her son in a miserable condition. It was an attic apartment, almost nothing there. Years before, she had gone and married against her parents' wishes. And she married a man that gave her a son. And the husband took her and her son to a foreign land. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? But while he was there, his real character began to come out. He was a philanderer. He was unfaithful. He was irresponsible. He spent all of the dowry that came with their marriage. And 3 years after their marriage, he passed away, leaving her unprotected, uncared for, with no provision for her or the child. And they found their way to this horrible living environment. But while they were there, she would tell stories to her son about her grandfather's house, the farm that he lived on, the trees that she used to climb as a child, the lush fields that she used to run in, the wildflowers there that were everywhere, and the smells coming out of the kitchen when her grandmother would cook were just incredible. And even though her son had never, ever visited the grandfather's ranch, it was his favorite place on the whole world. That was the place he wanted to be. Well, one day, a postman knocked on the attic door, handed her a letter. The letter had a simple envelope, simple stamp, and it had her name and address on it. And she knew it was her mother's handwriting. She opened the letter, and inside were 2 words, just 2 words on a note. Come home. Come home. What is God telling Naomi time and time and time again? Come home. Let's talk about it in the Hebrew. He's telling her to shuv, return. Why? Because he is the God of chesed, the loyal love of God that can only be found in relationship with him. When you're in relationship, a chesed relationship, because you've returned, you find that there is tikvah. There is hope beyond hope beyond hope, because in God, that hope is certainty. That's what the New Testament word for hope means, the certainty. And when you have that certainty, you cling to him. You dabak. We are called constantly to return to him, to shuv to that chesed relationship, because in that chesed relationship is hope. And when we find hope, we cling. And we cling like super glue with no antidote to the God of the universe, who can do it all and promises blessing upon blessing upon blessing. Come home. It's the call of God to us. Come home. Return to the land. Return to the blessing. Naomi does it. And here's the fascinating thing. When she does, God's already beginning to draw blessing into her life. Even in Moab, the blessing of food is now a reality because there is food in her land. The blessing of this, and it's going to be a fascinating thing to see next week, the blessing of this, who is standing right beside Naomi? Ruth, a woman who recognizes and is walking in the covenant blessing of God, who wants to be super glued to her. She's not coming back alone. Coming back with something that we'll learn in the chapter 4 is greater than 7 sons to Naomi. God has already begun to bless her and bless her abundantly. Can she see it yet? No, she can't. But the call of God to come home is a call that he calls to each one of us. We asked the question last week, where have I found myself walking away from God? It's at that point that we find him faithful to say, come home, come home, come home. Questions, thoughts?
Wow.
Is this as rich a story as you thought?
Yes. Better.
Well, we're going to tackle 15. I think actually we do we do 15 to the end of the chapter? Let me see.
I think
We'll be
so.
15 to the end of the chapter next week. And boy, are we going to get deep next week. We're going to have fun.
All right.
Any questions? Any thoughts?
You got to get out of here because
I'm
you're
headed.
supposed to be somewhere. So we'll discuss for sure.
You discuss. If you got questions, send them to me. Love to talk about it. Thanks for
Okay.
listening. We'll be here next week. See ya.
All right. Thank you, Mark. God bless.
Bye-bye.